This isn't going to replace my home setup, but it does have a place in my workflow. And in this video, I'm going to share my opinions on when and where it really shines, as well as answer a bunch of random questions I got about what it's like to work in Apple Vision Pro. Things like the Mac screen resolution, building visionOS apps on device, looking at notes through Passthrough, multitasking, and so much more. Before we dive into those rapid fire questions, let me give you my verdict on building iOS or visionOS apps in the Apple Vision Pro using the MacBook screen mirroring. It's not good enough to replace my home setup, and my home setup isn't anything crazy. As you can see, it's one external monitor, the Apple Studio display. 99% of the time my MacBook is in clamshell mode, so it's a pretty simple setup. And even with all the screens you can have all around you in the Apple Vision Pro, if I were to sit down to do serious work, I'm still sitting down at this desk. I'm not grabbing this thing. But when I don't have access to my home setup, whether I'm traveling or whatever, that's where the Apple Vision Pro shines for me. And that's because I really struggle doing like serious deep work with just my 14-inch laptop, that small screen. Now don't get me wrong, I could do little things here or there, or maybe a quick bug fix, but when it comes to that like serious deep feature work, right? When you're working 6 hours trying to get a feature built, I need screen real estate. I need multiple windows open side by side so I can see various areas of my code so I can keep, that puzzle going in my head so I can understand things and figure things out. I just struggle with that with just the laptop screen. Now I know many of you out there are probably pros on just the laptop screen. Super efficient, super productive. In that case, I'll say the Apple Vision Pro is going to be a worse experience almost all the time. But again, for me and my struggles with that little screen, I am going to reach for the Apple Vision Pro versus just the laptop screen, again, when I need to do some serious work. The other area where this really shines is probably pretty obvious, and that's when you're actually building an app for the Apple Vision Pro in visionOS. And that's because there's just no substitute for seeing your app run on a device. Even on a basic iPhone app, right? Yeah, the simulator is cool and all, but running your app on an actual iPhone is a totally different experience than playing with it on the simulator. And that is just magnified tenfold in this thing, right? The simulator, I guess you can kind of get by, you can see what it looks like, but it's a night and day different experience actually on device versus on the Xcode visionOS simulator. So if you're serious about building a visionOS app, then wearing the Apple Vision Pro while you're building that visionOS app is probably a must. And as a little side note, it's also a pretty cool experience following coding tutorials in the Apple Vision Pro. I mean, come on, who doesn't want a giant Sean teaching you a cool new SwiftUI API? All right, time for those rapid fire questions, because I put up this tweet asking you, what you were curious about. So I'm going to do my best to answer a bunch of those with some visual examples. First up, multitasking. At least for now, you can only have one Mac screen. Maybe this will change in a future update, but you can have a bunch of native visionOS apps all around you. And when mirroring your MacBook, your actual screen goes black, which I guess is pretty good for privacy. But having the visionOS native Safari app is great because it opens up, all the possibilities in the world for your workspace. You can have Stack Overflow, documentation, or even a YouTube video. But as you can see here in my setup, I have Safari, Music, Notes, and the Stocks app, which isn't native visionOS app, but it's that iPad compatible version. And of course, there's only a limited number of visionOS apps right now, but that will get better and better over time. And even though you can only have one MacBook display, as you can see, the whole world is like your display, and you can fit visionOS apps all around it. And everything still works fine if you decide you want to shut your MacBook and go in clamshell mode. Working in an immersive environment is awesome. You can even hear the wind howling around you. You really feel like you're there. But downside is that if you're fully immersed, you can't see your keyboard. Now, of course, you can pull back the immersion a bit so you can eventually see your keyboard, but that kind of sucks because as you can see, it breaks the immersion, if you look left or right, even just a little bit. So hopefully in the future, we get some keyboard occlusion. One thing I was really curious about was the latency between typing on your MacBook and what you see show up on the Mac mirroring. I'm happy to say that there's no perceptible latency when typing. It feels just like typing on your MacBook. Someone also asked me how pass-through is when looking at notes written on pen and paper. And this really depends on your lighting, the more lighting, the better. It's definitely doable, but you can really tell that you're looking at a video feed and not the real thing. And looking at your phone or iPad is kind of the same, right? It's a little blurry, but you can still read it. So even though it's not perfect, definitely doable. And again, how well lit the room is matters because with pass-through, it gets really noisy in low light and things are blurry. So I recommend being in as well lit room as possible. Now, how long was I able to work in this thing? After about an hour and a half, the weight really started to get to me. I got a little bit of eye strain. Now, of course, your mileage is gonna vary, right? Everyone's eyes are different, your neck strength is different. That being said, I do use the solo band because I'm lazy. Like, here's the dual loop band. I've never used it, like it's still in the packaging. It's just more complex and complicated than this solo band. So maybe this will help. I'm sure I'll try it eventually, but I can get a good hour and a half of working in, mind you, wearing these before the weight wears on me. Now, like watching a movie, laying back with my head on the couch, I could go for hours, but sitting there working, different story. So now let's talk about screen resolution when mirroring your MacBook. The default resolution is 2560 by 1440, and as you can see, I'm demonstrating 3 editor windows in Xcode at a very readable text size. You get as much screen real estate as you would on a typical external display like Apple Studio Display. As of now, you can't change the resolution to something like an ultra wide, so you can really take advantage of all the space you have. And I'm not sure how technically feasible that is to be able to change that kind of resolution, but wow, that would be awesome in the future. Like having an ultra wide anywhere I go, sign me the hell up. You can adjust to a higher resolution. In this case, it's 3840 by 2160, but it gets smaller and harder to see. I mean, you can adjust the text size. And of course, you can go the other way with it and go with a smaller resolution, so the elements on your screen are huge. But again, I think default is the way to go. I mean, it's probably the default for a reason. And here's what it looks like messing with the screen sizes, right? I make it real size, and then I blow the screen up as big as possible. And the video doesn't really do it justice. I mean, it feels like you're looking at a ridiculously giant Xcode screen. I don't know if I'd work like that, but it's a pretty cool experience nonetheless. Now, the text actually looks crisper in the screen recording than it does in real life. Like, it's definitely not as crisp as looking at it at a 4 or 5K display in real life. I'd say it's similar to looking at a 1080p display when it comes to, the crispness of the text. Now let's talk about what it's like to actually run your visionOS app physically on the device as you're coding it and wearing it. Now you have to do the typical device setup, right? Add it to your provisioning profile, register it, set up developer mode on the Vision Pro. Same thing you would have to do if you got like a new iPhone or a new iPad. So it's like nothing unique to the Vision Pro, but anytime you want to run on a real device and it's a brand new device, you have to do that setup first. But once you have that set up, now you can run your apps physically on the device. Here you can see me running Apple's sample Hello World app, right? It starts off with just a window, but then you can, I hit see orbits to see a 3D volume, and I can see the orbits right there. And then eventually I'll go into a fully immersive space where I can look all around me 360. So as you can see, there's huge value in running the app actually on a device and experiencing it in that 3D world, rather than just the simulator. Like the simulator doesn't even come close to doing it justice. Hell, this video doesn't even do it justice. But yes, if you're building a visionOS app, you can be coding it and build it right on the device to experience what you're building in real time. And in my opinion, that's really the only way to do it. So again, this is just not good enough quite yet to replace my home setup. Maybe it'll get there one day, probably take a few years, but right now it's just not there. That being said, like if I have to choose between this and grabbing just my laptop if I want to do serious work, I'm grabbing this. Because again, I struggle doing serious work on just a small laptop screen. Side note, this thing for content viewing, like watching movies, is an amazing experience. I think it's worth it just for that. So the fact that I can, have some productivity in a pinch on the side, just icing on the cake. I love this thing. I can't wait to see how it evolves over the next decade.